introduction, and thank you everybody for sharing your lunch hour with us. We are just thrilled to be part of CBITs and to have this opportunity to share some recent work we've been doing. The work is really not just Alex and ours. It's our entire Center for Evidence-Based Mentoring, which has been operating since 2012 and has been really a big part of where we are right now with our research. And after 30 years of studying mentoring, I tried to distill it all recently into a book called Older and Wiser: New Ideas for Youth Mentoring. And one of the first things I did as I sat down to write the book was really to take stock in how effective are mentoring programs. For those of you who may not know, formal mentoring programs are things like Big Brothers, Big Sisters, as well as maybe peer mentoring at the college level and everything in between. There's also natural mentoring, but today we're focusing on programmatically arranged formal mentor relationships. And the first thing I did when I tried to take stock of it was to look at all the meta-analyses that have ever been done on the field, dating all the way back to the early 90s. And this kind of was a very dispiriting recognition when I started to plot all the meta-analyses. What you see here is that since 2002, more than 20 years ago, the effect sizes have been relatively small. And that is despite, if you look at the green and the kind of mustard color, pretty sizable investments in research and federal spending. We're not moving the needle on the effect sizes in ways that we would hope, and in ways that we see in, say, clinical psychology, where we've seen a steady improvement in effect sizes for a lot of disorders. So really what began with this recognition was trying to figure out why mentoring programs were not more effective, and really looking first at the most dominant forms of mentoring, which is like Big Brothers, Big Sisters programs, which probably most of you have heard about, as well as funding by the federal government through the Department of Ed of many mentoring programs. And you see that what's common to all of these is what I would call the friendship approach. And that is this idea that you put caring people together. You have good intentions, you have a volunteer who wants to help, and you say, go and forge a relationship or a friendship and good things will happen. And so when I looked at that, I saw that not only is the effect size, 0.20, which is considered small, but it's actually closer to 0. And so we're putting millions of dollars, and more importantly, lots of hours of people's lives into this effort that is, if it was a clinical trial for a pharmaceutical, we might say, all right, let's stop doing that and try something else. But we're not doing that. We've been kind of keeping this dominant friendship model for more than a century. And it's because the word mentor is so evocative that people just, they had one in second grade or in college. And so they think if you put two people together, the same thing will happen. But that is not necessarily true. And one of the big problems is that mentoring programs are very focused on, and it came from this positive youth development program push when mentoring programs were really coming of age, focused on resilience and thriving and really good things. And they don't really focus on the fact that many of the young people who are referred to mentoring programs are suffering from pretty significant mental health problems, high levels of anxiety, depression, trauma exposure, attention difficulties. And when we compare the rates, which were often over 40% of the young people who are referred to these programs, what we see is that they are double the rates of American children and adolescents in general. So we're taking a group that is very high, also high in marginalization, in poverty. We're taking a group that's, experienced a tremendous amount of difficulty, and we're telling them that things will get better if they just hang out with this big brother who's minimally trained. In fact, that's kind of the way that we recruit mentors. We say, you don't need a lot of skills, just hang out, listen, and things will get better. And they're not. And it's not only a frustration to the families that are often referring their youngsters and adolescents to mentoring programs in hopes of things getting better, it's frustrating to the mentors. And what you see here is that overall, most mentoring programs do not last as long as they're intended. The rate is around 38% overall, and this was looking at tens of thousands of relationships over time. But the rates of attrition, early attrition, go way higher when you factor in the baseline risk of the young person coming into the program. And so you've got somebody who may have anxiety or depression, and those relationships are more than 50% likely to terminate early. And I've done research that shows early terminations of relationships are actually not neutral. They can actually be a setback for young people. And so we need to do more to prepare and help address the issues that parents and others are referring their youngsters to programs for. So there has been a movement. Michael Lyons, Sam McQuillan, others have said, look, we need to kind of find the sweet spot. Yes, the relationship is absolutely important. It is the sine qua non of the entire enterprise. However, once you form that relationship, let's leverage it to do something useful, to do something targeted, to work on the presenting problem that was first put there. And so actually, when we went back and looked at the effect sizes of programs that were more targeted, you see really impressive effect sizes. My friend Michael Karcher, look at those effect sizes at the top, and others are getting those effects. So we know it's possible. But the other thing to note when you look at this is that those programs tend to be pretty specialized. So they're often incubated in universities with highly trained students who are compensated for going through this training. It's hard to scale those kinds of programs. So we began a lot of this after I wrote the book, looking at when is mentoring most effective. And one of the things that we found really surprising, we did a meta-analysis of the first ever of peer mentoring, and we found that the effects of peer mentoring were more than double those of intergenerational mentoring, which was quite surprising. We also, we had done a meta-analysis, it was on that chart, and we got effect sizes around 0.2 or lower overall. But when we looked at programs that focused on specific challenges and goals, we got effect sizes that were 2 to 3 times higher, which again, is very telling and gives us a path forward. And finally, there was this interesting effect that we keep getting. It's one of the loudest signals in all the noise of these evaluations, and that is if the mentor has some sort of background in helping professions, they tend to produce higher effects. And so this was, we used it as a moderator, and again, we found it had an effect. So you put all that together. I'm going to go dig a little deeper, and then I'll tell you how that led us to technology-delivered interventions. So these are some of the meta-analyses. We've kind of been on a tear. Someone gave us a hammer, and we just keep putting out meta-analyses now. We have one on group mentoring coming out, and others. But when you compare across these programs, you see something interesting. As those, as I mentioned, the cross-age peers are making a big difference, and also programs that are more specialized, that maybe require more training. And here's what's interesting about the peer mentoring effect, though, and that is that when there is not a high level of oversight, you get effect sizes that are close to zero. So my hypothesis is there's not something magical necessarily, although there are theories that, peers are more credible messengers, but that we don't trust peer mentors as much. So we give them a lot more structure, a lot more training, and we may be picking up on a training, supervision, oversight effect as much as anything else. And so again, that tells us peer mentoring is great. And what's really nice is it's a replenishable resource. You have sophomores, juniors, and seniors helping every incoming class of freshmen. It's much easier to recruit peer mentors in educational settings, but we have to provide the training and support necessary. And I mentioned that, non-specific versus targeted. These effect sizes aren't huge, but they're a lot bigger than ones that are, non-specific, the friendship model. And you actually see these same sort of patterns. John Weitz and his colleagues have done a lot of this research with meta-analyses, and he compares non-specific to targeted and gets kind of the same pattern of effects higher, but the same thing, that this whole idea of the common factors, that it's just the relationship, is really debunked when you begin to look at these effects, because not only is it twice as effective overall, but for things that programs care about, it's 3 times more effective. Look at mental health, for example. And we were not able to code for whether or not the program was evidence-based, because there's simply not enough of those. But you can imagine an evidence-based mental health program that was targeted having an even bigger effect. So this all was very promising and kind of a relief. My book starts out pretty sour on the field, and I kind of wrote myself into a corner, and then I began to look and see answers. And that's what led to what we're going to talk about. And so, am I going backwards? Let me just see. Okay, so what we need to do is think about relationships as not the intervention, but as the context for the delivery of evidence-based intervention. One thing that I'm often misunderstood on is I'm not just saying we need to build skills. The relationship absolutely has to be front and center. But once you have that and you've developed enough trust, you don't need to keep developing trust. In fact, there's this interesting study that showed it's almost a bell curve, that you get to a certain level, and then you should begin to leverage that relationship. You shouldn't just continue to try to have the longest, strongest relationship possible, because it often means that it's kind of not focused. But how do you do that? And, as I mentioned, a lot of the more targeted programs are what I might call boutique programs. They go really deep into one topic, like mentoring for young people who are transitioning out of foster care. And Heather Taussig at University of Denver has some brilliant studies that just show that, if you can really find your niche and go deep into that with evidence, you can get great effects. But that's not how most mentoring programs work. If you think about like a Big Brothers Big Sisters or a college peer mentoring program where every kid gets a mentor, every single person may have a different constellation of presenting strengths and problems. There may be issues around, mental health, or around trauma exposure, or around, just learning disabilities, language, newcomer immigrants, whatever. And programs need to be responsive. Mentors need to have the right tools for each of those things. But how on earth can a program have the bandwidth to train mentors in every single issue or alchemy of issues that might come in? And that's why I when I picked the jumbo store, I picked Target, because I do think it's possible to target, but it's not going to be through our typical ways. So I came up with this kind of framework that here's how mentoring programs could potentially work. All mentoring programs do what they do great. If you look at that kind of beige bar at the top, let them recruit mentors, screen them, do the police background checks, train them, supervise them, do everything to keep that relationship going. And if you're a small boutique targeted program, go for it. You continue to do what you're doing because we know it's having good effects in most cases. But for larger non-specific programs, one of the things that I'm going to just talk for a minute about embedded is mentoring programs can sometimes dispatch their mentors into school systems or into, juvenile justice systems or mental health systems, and train the mentor to be kind of a sponsor or a support. In Massachusetts, there's this whole thing called therapeutic mentoring. And so you can embed them in the systems of care that young people are already finding themselves. Or, and this is where we'll move, we can train them to support, not to deliver, but to support the amazing array of technology-delivered mental health interventions that are out there and that are continuing to be developed and not used adequately. And so they can do that through a term that really I credit, CBITs and supportive accountability, and also through supervised practice of skills that young people might be learning in therapy or through their technology-delivered intervention. So the promise of digital interventions, everyone in this audience probably knows, but for me, as I began to explore it, thinking about how it could work with, young people, particularly those who are marginalized, who do not have access to clinical care, are just amazing and have so much promise. And, even just today, I saw that Apple new operating system is going to have a mental health digital therapeutic piece built in. It's taking off for very, very good reasons. And if you think about what a mentor could do, they could really support young people in remaining engaged in those. And we have partnerships and are very excited about some of the best that are out there. Mind Trails, which Alex worked on with Bethany Teachman at University of Virginia, and of course, IntelliCare Plus, which I'm just beginning to learn about, is phenomenal, as well as ones that we've all heard of, Headspace and others, could really be an early, less stigmatized way to get the mental health care that young people need. But we all know the problems with these, and that is there is massive attrition. First of all, it's we could not find the statistic, and maybe you guys know, but it's close to 70% of young people get off these apps shortly after downloading them. And, if you think about particularly young people using apps, they love to jump around from one to the other to the next. And so it's really hard because you don't really have the fidelity to the treatment if somebody's jumping in and out of the treatment. There's also the issue of curation, that most of the market is absorbed by two apps in the mental health field, Calm and Headspace. And those are good for mindfulness, but there's a lot of other things like the need for treatment around social anxiety, around eating disorders, around other things. And so there's a need, and CyberGuide and others are doing this, but for marginalized families to have somebody to help curate those apps and put them right in the hands of the young people. And then there's misuse people not even understanding the sequence or how they work. And so there's a real need for supportive accountability. So this is where I think supportive accountability is such an important feature. We talk in AI now, there needs to be a human in the loop. There needs to be a human in the loop for mental health apps to keep people using them. And if you think about, this is David Moore and Steve Schuster's and others' definition, if you read the second part of that, a coach who is seen as trustworthy, having more expertise and benevolent, that is a mentor often, especially after that friendship is formed. So it's a perfect role for a mentor. And then Colleen Conley and Joe Durlak and others up in Chicago, that's where a lot of this is being done apparently, show that, if you don't practice the skill you're learning, it doesn't stick, just like any other skill. And so often we have to kind of rush through one to the next, and you need to learn how to integrate those skills. And that's a perfect role for mentors as well, to role play and practice it with them. And so, Alex and our team actually did a recent systematic meta review of the use of human support in digital mental health interventions. And we did find that the effects, 22 out of 45 showed stronger effects when there was human support for them. There was no clear pattern. There was mixed findings for anxiety, but overall, what was really interesting was that there wasn't a big difference between a highly trained coach who was providing the supportive accountability or a paraprofessional. And we're going to talk about that because that is a finding that dates all the way back to Joe Durlak's earliest work, where he showed that a well-trained paraprofessional produced the same effects as highly trained psychologists and psychiatrists. And here we're seeing the same thing for digital mental health coaching. So we think, I'm doing it again. We think that both supportive accountability and supervised practice, we recently published a brand new study on how important supervised practice is for young people, that, constructive feedback and practice led to larger effects for mental health outcomes, particularly for internalizing behavior. And so again, we see that those could be potentially very powerful roles. And we have just tried to confirm that in our work. But how do we scale human support, the kinds of things that we know matter, like human support, like supervised practice, across all the young people who are using digital therapeutics? And that's where we think mentoring comes in. And we actually developed a framework for doing that. And we're happy to share any of these papers, but in this paper with Sam McQuillan and Alex and some other in my lab, Matt Hagler, we show, we really laid out that some of the things I've just told you, that paraprofessional mentors are being underutilized. If you think about what they're doing, they're giving an hour a week to a stranger and entering a quasi-therapeutic relationship outside the family, and yet they're being told to just hang out and play basketball. That's not enough. We have the system in place for a quasi-therapeutic paraprofessional relationship, and we haven't been leveraging it enough. And so we lay out some of the ethical issues involved in that, but the huge promise, and it really does align with global mental health and, all of the movements that are going on around trying to bridge gaps in mental health care, because they will never be bridged with highly trained psychiatrists, psychologists, and social workers trying to bridge that gap. It's got to be well-trained paraprofessionals, and well-trained paraprofessionals supporting really well-developed digital tools seems very promising. Alex, was I supposed to pass it to you at this moment? Or, oh no, almost.
Nope, not yet.
Okay. So with that theory in mind, we wrote a grant to the National Institute of Mental Health and got a phase 1 STTR to start like a small business around trying to build a supportive accountability platform with mental health apps that had been proven effective. And we did that through trying to get either an API integration with the app so the mentor could see whether or not the young person had opened it, or a deep link. And we were off. I presented it to the National Office of Big Brothers Big Sisters. They embraced it. We had other programs embracing it. We had funding to test it, and it didn't work. Okay. So we thought it would work, but we put it to the test, and it wasn't even like we were able to put it to a great rigorous clinical test. We couldn't even get people to use it. Okay. It was during the pandemic, but even so, there was a hunger for digital connection, and young people often didn't have access to their own dedicated device. They did not want to work on something. They were being asked to work on lots of other things remotely. They didn't, their volunteer they had learned was somebody that could just be a friend to them and take them out. Volunteers who are very hard to recruit and retain for programs, they didn't want to do it. They hadn't been told to do it. It just felt like an added layer of work that they couldn't do. Caseworkers who ran the programs across the board, and we're not just talking about Big Brothers Big Sisters, Friends of the Children, smaller programs, schools, nobody wanted to do it, and we tried so hard, and programs resisted evaluation. So picture all those layers of resistance, including parents' resistance around security, and then us saying, you know what, we're going to randomize this. First of all, programs had pretty much shut down for the pandemic, and we're saying, okay, hold back half your matches and try this unknown thing of digital therapeutics. And it just failed. That's all I can say. We tried and tried, other investigators tried, and we couldn't get it. We couldn't get the momentum we needed. So I'm going to leave you on that down note and turn it over to Alex. Alex, do you want to pull up your own?
Yep, I am doing that now.
Okay.
All right. So thank you, Jean. Jean leaves off at kind of a downer note. We worked so hard, right? Like all of the team members worked really, really hard. So I'm excited to share kind of what direction we decided to take our work in, since it was a little challenging during the pandemic, and really trying to sell these youth-focused programs on kind of this mentor hub model, right? So Jean said all of this really beautiful evidence, this beautiful theory of really pairing these mentors who are really motivated to provide support to young people with these young people who really need these evidence-based tools. Like Jean said, it flopped. So where the heck are we moving next? So I don't have to tell many of you, but I will go over just the basic stats, right? Many college students are struggling, right? Not news, but what we know is that just under half of undergraduate students drop out of college without finishing their degree. 3/4 of students who leave college do so for non-academic reasons. And college students meet criteria for at least one mental health challenge, and that is over half, right? So we know that college students are really struggling. And I know a lot of you on this call have done work in the college student space. What we also know is that not only are students kind of struggling on their own with mental health, navigating college, but students don't always know how to access the right support on time, right? So we know that students lack knowledge and support on how to find and access resources at their university. We know that there is unnecessary escalation of students' early concern to highly trained professionals. And on the university side, we know that there are inefficiencies in connecting students with these resources, right? So you can imagine a student who says like, hey, I'm worried about this test, right? They could be triaged to any number of academic resources, mental health resources. So how do we actually know who is going to be the most appropriate person or system to help that student with that concern? Universities also have really ineffective responses in some cases, right, to students' early struggles. And so this might result in cognitive load on the part of the student and really attrition across programs. So then we came in and Jean came in with Mentor Pro. So our team has pivoted from the youth space to the college space and the career development. So really focusing on these young adults, right? Young adults in college, young adults who are still figuring out and forging their career path ahead of them. And so with Mentor Pro, we are looking to improve programs, relationships, and outcomes. And we have launched this new app and multi-sided tool. So Mentor Pro is built on features that work. So some of those features and some of those pieces that Jean talked about earlier, but also pulling together pieces of academic institutions that work, right? So what we're doing is we're taking a student success platform. We have training, support, and expertise and high impact mentoring, like Jean talked about. We have seamless connection between mentors and mentees and program staff with Mentor Pro. We have continuous engagement, which I'll get into. And then really you can think about this as a concierge support for college students and for young adults entering the workforce. So in Mentor Pro, the user experience on the part of the mentee side is that students and young adults can complete check-ins. So this provides us and programs with data on how students are doing. Also importantly, it lets students actually track how they're doing over time. It also allows them to set goals and chat securely with their mentors. What's nice about this is that it kind of combines all of those features that Jean has been talking about, really. So thinking about specific goal-focused relationships while building up that warm, fuzzy, personal piece of the mentoring relationship. And also providing us with data on how students and young adults are doing over time as they engage with this platform. What I really like too is that it provides transparency to programs and staff. So our sophisticated backend shows data, it allows access to chats. So really we can make sure that these trained peer mentors, so sorry, I forgot to mention that in a lot of these cases where we're using Mentor Pro, we're really rolling it out with peer mentors or older students within the same program so that these peer mentors have kind of the credible messenger appeal, right? They are trusted by these students, but also they're a little bit older. They've kind of seen the ways of the university or the program that they're serving, and we train them really, really well, or their program trains them really, really well. So programs and staff then have access to the sophisticated backend where they can see the chat history, they can see how all the mentees are doing. And one of my favorite parts of Mentor Pro is that we've built out the Mentor Pro Academy. So the Academy is a set of both synchronous and asynchronous courses where mentors and students and staff can all take evidence-based courses with us, where we've distilled down some of the best practices for both mentoring and professional development. I recently taught a course on mentoring for youth mental health. That was a 12-week live course that people really liked. We have courses, as you can see, on kind of how to build your career and how to build a strong mentoring relationship. We also have data analytics and visualizations for program staff. So in real time, we can actually help programs see how their students are doing and engaging in Mentor Pro. And Mentor Pro integrates with some of those best in practice evidence-based apps, right? So we connect students with apps like Duolingo so that they can do a little bit better in their language course, right? With like Healthy Minds, with IntelliCare, right? With Headspace, some of these best in the field apps. And our team can help with the evaluation. So we work with programs to come up with evidence-based and evidence-supported questions for their specific programs. And then we roll out those questionnaires to the students using Mentor Pro. And so then on the back end, we can provide programs with an evaluation of how their mentoring program is actually working. So with all of that kind of in mind, you've seen kind of some of the back end information and back end experiences that our users have. We took a pilot from 2021 to 2022 at a university in Boston, and we looked at engagement with Mentor Pro. And we found that first generation students had significantly higher proportion of financial, academic habits, and health well-being referrals. So when first generation students were actually engaging with the app, engaging with their mentors, they were really reporting these different struggles than their continuing generation peers, which is really useful information to the university, right? So the university understands how to provide targeted support to their students, but also really good because each of these students then got this concierge service and concierge referral for the things that they actually needed. We also found that a greater number of completed check-ins, so with reporting how you're doing week to week, students who did more check-ins had a higher GPA. Now, this was not an RCT. We aren't able to kind of look at the causal relationship here, but it's really interesting to us, kind of thinking about how there might be a relationship with engaging with Mentor Pro, engaging with the resources at your university, and engaging with that trained peer mentor. We also found that students really liked the app. Most students were using it. They found resources helpful, and most students used the check-in feature. So then over the following summer, we're in some of these conversations with the university, and Jean pops in and she goes, you know what would be really cool is if we paired students who are about to start at the university with their peer mentor, right? Think about when college students are most excited about the university that they're going to, and that is that summer as they're preparing for their transition. They're buying their sweatshirts, they're getting their swag, they're thinking about packing, like, what is my dorm gonna look like? It's gonna be super cool. So we get them on Mentor Pro, we pair them with their peer mentor, and then they can spend the summer asking questions, what it's like to be a student, like, what is the weather like? What is my dorm gonna be like? So these mentors can actually forge this connection and start answering any questions that students have. So we rolled out Mentor Pro the summer of 2022. So I can't believe that was a year ago. And we found amazing engagement just over the first month or so, right? So students really started downloading and messaging their peer mentor. So over the next year, so the 2022 academic year, we looked at the first semester, so last fall. We looked at the data of the incoming first year class, and we did a propensity score matching analysis where we matched students, all incoming students, on known risk factors. So this is like age, gender, underrepresented minority status, first generation status, and critically their high school GPA, right? Because we know high school GPA can be a predictor of how students are going to do later on. So we did propensity score matching on those students, and we actually found that for students who used Mentor Pro more throughout their first semester, we actually found that they had a higher GPA at the end of the first semester. We found that they had a greater sense of belonging to their university community. We also found that they felt more confident in their ability to be a successful student. And that single item alone is known to predict academic GPA and persistence throughout the course of a student's academic career. And students, so not only in the academic sphere, we also found findings that increased engagement or greater engagement and messaging with their peer mentor meant that students felt satisfied with life overall. So not only are we able to support students in kind of their academic functioning, but really with their well-being as a human, right, in their own lives day to day. So we're really excited to be working not only with universities, but we're also currently working with the Council of Opportunity and, I'm going to butcher this one.
Education.
Thank you, Education, COE. We're working also with EV Kids, a Boston-based mentoring program, and Step Up Women's Network, which focuses on helping women and people who identify with girlhood to be ready for their careers. So they're all going to be starting to use Mentor Pro with these peer mentors. So we've just talked at you about kind of what we've been doing. And now I want to take just a couple of minutes and keeping an eye on the time, thinking about our future directions. So as Jean mentioned, we are currently working on a phase 1 of an STTR with NIMH. And our next step this summer is hopefully this week, we're going to be rolling out an RCT at University of Massachusetts, Boston, and we're going to be randomly assigning those peer mentors to use Mentor Pro or not. And we're really excited to see how a cohort of summer students who are preparing for their UMass Boston journey are going to do with connecting with their peer mentors on Mentor Pro versus not. And as we wrap up phase 1, we are really excited. We are hopeful to receive phase 2 funding. We got a really exciting score, so stay tuned. But in phase 2, what we would be doing is testing Mentor Pro more rigorously with more diverse students. We would rigorously test Headspace and other evidence-based apps with college students and Mentor Pro. So really understanding how Mentor Pro mentors can support students using evidence-based apps for their mental health. And what we're really excited about is thinking about how can we start to infuse AI features into Mentor Pro. By no means are we thinking about kind of replacing our wonderful mentors with AI, but we have some ideas for how these things can start to work together synergistically. And of course, thinking about how can we recruit mentors and how can we create workforce development to both not only or to support student mental health kind of and well-being, and really think about making sure that students have kind of this renewable access to the people who can support them along their journey. So just kind of thinking about some of these artificial intelligence and Mentor Pro ideas, we'll throw some of these fun ones out here. So one idea that we have is thinking about how AI can suggest chat responses to mentors, right? So imagine a student in their first year is messaging their mentor and they're saying, I'm really struggling with how to study for this test. I have no idea like how to study. I'm really worried. I don't know what the heck is going on. This is, I haven't done math since, junior year of high school. I don't know what I'm doing. Their mentor then, can get in their app and their Mentor Pro app, and AI would then be able to show potentially, right, how the student did in high school, or maybe what the student is currently struggling with based on their responses in the app. AI can pull in important features, right, about that student, and then make recommended responses. But the mentor would then be able to select the most appropriate response or curate their own response based on all the information that they have, right? So never letting AI just kind of jump in, but instead allowing mentors to get all the information they need and then make a response based on what makes the most sense. Then we're thinking about how can AI actually scrub and scrape university resources and populate kind of a one-stop shop for students so that in the Mentor Pro app, they can access all of their university's information, kind of have FAQs, be able to meet with their, advisors, whatever they might need in the moment, but having AI kind of scrape that information and distill it down into a digestible resource for students. Oops. And then finally, thinking about how can we use natural language processing within these chats so that chats can be scanned for both mental health risk and suicide risk, right? So really thinking down the line of how can these messages be monitored. And kind of an abrupt end, but that is kind of our presentation. Thank you all so much. We have plenty of time for questions. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And Jean, anything you want to add at the end?
No, just thank you. That was great. And thanks for the opportunity. So anybody that has any questions, we're very happy to answer.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much. And it's so exciting to see all the progression. And particularly, I mean, if you have one slide, it's the one where it's like the numbers, I mean, it's really incredible. It's really amazing. And it also, ironic, looked like 0, but even then it was still hundreds of people coming on board in the beginning, but now it's exponential. Very exciting. We have lots of questions coming through. Excuse me. So I'll pitch them out. But some of them I'll read them to the full group. So the first question was, you might get this a lot, but it's an important one. In bringing in additional training and professional requirements for volunteer mentors, are we taking them out of a volunteer space and into more of a professional, so regulated, paid space? So is that really significantly changing the face of mentoring? And how do you think about that?
I'll take a stab at that one, Alex. I think that the field is actually moving a little bit in that direction. And I think that there's always volunteers. You can think about it as workforce development for the volunteers. If they're taking more training, this is something they can put on LinkedIn. This is something they can say they were trained in therapeutic mentoring or career mentoring or things like that. And we are actually issuing certificates through the Center for Evidence-Based Mentoring because I believe that the mentor should be rewarded too. That nobody is purely altruistic, and that might just be a dark thing, but I think a lot of people do volunteer for career benefits so that they can list it. Well, we might as well make that visible. And then the paid mentoring, certainly at universities that we've worked at, we always encourage, even if it's just $15 an hour, paid mentoring so that there is accountability. And just because someone is paid doesn't mean that the relationship is any less valuable. You think about teacher-student relationships. It's not like, well, the teacher isn't volunteering, so how could it possibly be authentic? That's the same thing with mentoring. So I believe that as we move toward more paraprofessional models like therapeutic mentoring, what we see in mass, where actually bachelor's level trained mentors can get third-party payment, that we are moving in this direction, but it doesn't diminish volunteer mentoring because there's other ways to compensate them.
Fantastic. Thank you. Alex, anything to add? Or
I think just one thing that we're really excited about is we have a master's student, Megan Jasmine, who is looking at kind of why people get involved with mentoring at their universities. So what motivates these students? And then we're really excited to kind of see what she learns, but how that motivation really relates to kind of their job satisfaction, but then also the mentee outcomes.
I'm going to jump around, but it's kind of sort of a related question, which not related, but it's an interesting offshoot is one, thank you for the tremendous presentation. This person writes, could Mentor Hub be used with parent peer mentors? For example, could parent peer mentors provide supportive accountability for a behavior management app? In theory, parents may be motivated to engage in goal-focused supervised practice more than maybe youth peers.
That's a great question. So kind of anecdotally, so during my postdoc, Jean and I, along with Bethany Teachman, we created Mind Trails Teen, which is essentially a cognitive bias modification app that is for anxious teenagers. And our goal was to have teens with anxiety recruit their mentor through like big brothers, big sisters, right? So the person that they were already working with, and then they would use Mentor Hub to track, the mentor would use Mentor Hub to track when the student or when the teen was actually using the intervention. Like Jean said, we had a number of barriers, right? It was rolled out during the pandemic. It was tough to get recruitment. But what we found is that a lot of teens and a lot of parents contacted us and were like, could I do this with my kid? Like, is this something that I could help them with, right? Could I provide supportive accountability? We didn't end up going that route for that study since it was for mentors, but I think the hunger is there and it would be something really exciting to test out.
Yes, and that's, relates to some of the work that Noelle Hurd and others are doing where, and certainly Sarah Schwartz, where people are training young people to recruit their own mentors. And they may recruit a parent to make them accountable for change, or a grandparent or an extended family. So I think that's a really good model. We're also finding that therapists could potentially use it. If they're assigning digital therapeutics, they can make sure that the young person is actually doing their homework during the week, actually opening the app. And if they're not opening the app, we would turn to Andrea Graham and say, well, what are the 5 failure points and how might we get this young person to open their app? And so I think that there really is a more than just peer mentoring, and certainly more than just mentoring. There's a lot there.
Thank you. Another interesting one, the opening question is, how are you keeping people on the platform? Which I think part of it is, this model, but I've seen programs that used the platform initially, but once people found out it was easier to call or email, they would go around it, which would make data collection really hard. And do you find that, here it's like ironic if people are on campus, it sort of can stem into non-platform relationships. And in some ways, maybe that's the dream, but in other ways, not from a research perspective. Can you speak more to that?
I'll start by saying that the app contains a lot of push notifications. And so we recently did a survey of continued app use, at the very end of the second semester. And a lot of the students still had it on either their homepage or one page in, and we're getting these nudges and push notifications. And so because there's more, and because they're doing the check-in and filling out what their goals are, and their goals may change, and that there's kind of a stickiness to it because it's more than just a chat app. However, I don't necessarily mind. I like having all the chats within the app because then we can do natural language processing, and there's a lot more oversight, and you can require it if you want. But I do believe that if this can be used during transitions, and then it merges into a face-to-face long-term relationship, that's a win as well. And I just want to correct that we actually are kind of flipping between Mentor Hub and Mentor Pro, the terms. Mentor Hub is actually still around, and it's K-12 nonprofit. And Mentor Pro is the one that we got, that we're doing STTR funding to try to commercialize.
You sort of started to touch on this, but what are related to actually doing chats there? What are the safeguards in place if students raise concerns about mental health, suicidality currently in the program? How do you guys address that?
Alex, do you want to?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously that's a really important question. I think probably a lot of the attendees, and Jean and I are both clinical psychologists, right? We're really mindful of student mental health concerns. I think first and foremost is rigorous peer mentor training, right? So they all have to go through training before they can be in touch with students on how to escalate appropriately. All of these peer mentors are also supervised throughout the year. So they can go to their supervisor with kind of concerns, questions, really like how to raise, they can raise issues, but they also have kind of 24-hour support if they need it. And so also students, as the users are both connected with their peer mentor and get into Mentor Pro, they're told specifically too that it's not meant to be a crisis resource, right? So kind of covering our asses, but also being very transparent with students that like we can't respond necessarily in a crisis. Jean, I don't know if you have anything.
I'll just add to that. I think this is going to be a very important piece for AI and natural language processing, because there's actually like 120 different phrases that could signal suicidality. Now, you don't want a false positive where every time somebody uses one of those, it leads to this big escalation. And that's where a peer mentor could get a trigger, like a push notification that says this term has been used, and they can say, oh, well, here's the context. And so that's why it's really important to have the human in the loop. And the other thing is that if there's a delta from one week to the next on the mental health check-in, they slide, it automatically triggers supervision of that text and of that person.
That's really nice and important as you're describing. How much time is required for mentor training, and what are the criteria for selecting mentors?
Great question. So it depends on the program. So at the university that we rolled out the pilot year and this past year, the university is actually responsible for recruitment and the majority of the training. And so Recruitment is usually just older students, so either graduate students or undergrads who are in their second year or higher. And I'm sure I know they go through like rigorous interviews, so it's not just kind of any old student, but I think most students could get trained. But this student has to be motivated to be a peer mentor. And then they go through a few days of training. So not only in those good escalation policies and like how to support a student in crisis, also what are the different resources that students have access to on campus and how to kind of pair them with the appropriate resources. And then I have done some training on like supportive accountability and SMART goals and kind of our basic kind of clinical psych interventions that I believe, and that probably a lot of you all believe, that any trained person can actually do with somebody who needs support. So
one future direction that I think would be really cool is that mentors could maybe specialize. So if you're a psychology sophomore, junior, senior, and you wanted more intensive training around working with students who have escalated mental health problems, you could go that path versus the ones that are interested in career development or whatever. And so you could kind of build. And the other thing is really looking at matching of mentors and mentees. It's been really hard. I've been in this for 30 years, and I even worked with actually a Nobel laureate who studied matching algorithms, and we could not find a good matching algorithm for mentoring. So if you ever hear someone say they have one, it's really hard because there's so many variables. But I believe that we can now begin to really look at it using machine learning and stuff at a more granular level, not just personality, but all sorts of factors, racial, cultural, ethnic identity, that might lead to greater affinity. And some of that might also be around the things that matter most at baseline to the mentee.
And actually, as you were presenting, a question came in that said, so how do you match currently?
Yeah, so at this one particular university, they did not have kind of, they didn't necessarily want to assume that students wanted to be matched on their own specific demographic backgrounds, right? So I think in some cases, yes, it's going to be really nice to have a student with a similar background, kind of who's been at the university, provide you with support. On the other hand, we don't want to make that assumption that all students want that. So we went into it with the idea that initially for the first couple of years, we would match based on college. So students who have similar course experience would provide mentorship to incoming students so that they could answer questions about what it's like being a student in that major.
I'll just add, as you know, I was one of the architects of this. They really wanted me to suggest other matching variables, but I, as an experimentalist, thought the fewer things we control, the more we can actually have randomization and look back and see which ones were stronger, which is what we're doing right now.
That's really cool. There's still lots of great questions all coming in. Thank you for this fantastic presentation. Love, quote, providing human support with the use of digital mental health, sort of the whole concept. So that was a nice positive. Just trying to scroll through. Okay, the big difference in adopting digital mentoring program between high school students and college students is very interesting. Have you thought about why? And are you considering how to address the need for mentors in high school or middle school kids?
I'll take it. So when we decided to pivot to college, we left the middle school, elementary school market to the original product, and that's actually still active. So we're not trying to compete with that group. There is some way in which, if it's high school to college, we can get involved as long as it's college people are getting mentored as well. And I believe that Mentor Pro has a place for this, and so does Mentor Hub, and they're just two different markets right now.
I think also kind of what we saw is that when we started trying to pair youth with interventions, it became very tricky to think about, like, when do parents play a role, right? Because if we're going to youth who are under 18 who have a mentor, if we're mostly working with the mentoring organization, asking them to make recommendations for mental health apps, the kid might come home and be like, look, my mentor told me to use this. And like the parent might be like, what, you're anxious? Like, I didn't know this, right? So there becomes a whole nother layer of ethical kind of quandaries and difficulties. And I think, at least for us in the middle of like this pandemic with all of these various layers, it became just a challenge, as kind of, I think all of us faced with our research. But that was definitely something that we saw with that added layer of like, what role do parents and guardians play?
Love that. We have about 2 minutes left. And there's a question in here that I thought was fabulous. And so you talked about some future directions, but if you don't want to end on this, that's no problem. You can end on a different one. But basically they said, will you explore similar focuses? Are there urgent and underexplored areas you haven't gotten into yet? And so you might not have the answers, but sort of here where you see like, important needs in this topic.
Alex, do you want to take that?
Go for it.
Well, for me, the issue of global mental health is so pressing. I mean, we have a mental health crisis, and yes, we're able to get it to some college students whose colleges are willing to invest in it. But how do we get this, if not this platform, other platforms to really bridge human support of these digital therapeutics? And that's just a very big challenge, because there's just so many issues involved once you take it out of a closed system. But I really believe that if we're ever going to address the global mental health crisis, we need to figure out how to do that.
Good ending point. Thank you to you both for an amazing presentation, to those who are listening, and wonderful questions. And we'll see you in the fall. This was fantastic.
And
thank
please
you.
follow up with us if you have any further questions. Thanks so much, Andrea, and everyone.
Yeah, thank you so much.
All right, take care.
Bye.